Before I start, I wanted to thank some people that are coming to mind. I have a long history with this book, starting with my mother, who bought a very poorly bound edition of Don Quixote by Editores Mexicanos Unidos. Falling apart, but it had all the Gustave Doré illustrations. And I just remember being very young and just looking at them. And that has stayed with me. And at this college, of course, I worked with a tutor back in the day, Arcelia Rodriguez, and with a great committee of Michael Wolf, David McDonald, and Victoria Mora. And later on at graduate school with a nice lady from New England, Mary Gaylord, who was my mentor and also crazed by this book. And recently with a senior, Jacob Kaufman, who's been talking with me. So all of these people and more have inflected what I'm about to say tonight. What is reading? As an activity, reading is central to intellectual life, and it also constitutes the central activity of the work we ourselves do here at St. John's. And yet, are there ways in which reading can become problematic? Consider this immediate example. Although grades are de-emphasized here, one nonetheless comes across a common evaluative statement, most often employed in its positive sense, namely that of calling someone a good reader. But what makes one a good reader? A question that quickly brings up the obvious follow-up, although perhaps more frightful question, what makes one a bad reader? By good reading, do we mean being able to pay careful attention to the words of a written text? Do we mean being able to connect, synthesize, and form a coherent interpretation from seemingly disparate parts of a carefully crafted linguistic construction, whether that language privileges the logical and discursive or the affective and aesthetic? By good reading, do we mean an astute use of the imagination that leads us to contemplate the images of the text with lucidity and care? And here lies a mystery. Through some intuition, there to touch the central nerves of the text by asking it a question that seems to get to the heart of the matter. Does good readership mean asking a question by means of which we are finally able to meet the text right on its meaning, that is, to access some of what it wants to say? Does good reading mean that we feel what we ought to feel when we read Sappho, and that we think what we ought to think when we read Aristotle? One could envision the bad reader as the one who simply does the contrary or none of the above. But so what? What is at stake in being a good reader or a bad reader of books? Is it hyperbolic to say that good reading in our context strives to get at the truth that any given text might be keeping from us? Or are there any other ways of reading beyond truth-seeking? I will advance here today that Cervantes teaches us that good reading is an art. And by art, I mean to designate a praxis that remains flexible and improved by continuous experience, as opposed to something prescriptive, final, and enclosed. For I will also like to put forth that great novels, and Don Quixote in particular, explicitly initiate us into the art of reading, and not the science of reading or the laws of reading. In fact, I hope to show that flexibility proves to be crucial to reading artfully. Furthermore, also following Cervantes, I will invite us to think about the notion of reading more broadly. What complications can arise concerning the activity of reading if the text is not simply the codified and symbolic construction of language that we encounter in written form? What if ourselves and the world constitute a kind of text that can be read? Don Quixote asks us to consider the art of reading not only as hermeneutics or interpretation of a written text, and not only to consider the impact of literature on our cognitive processes and imaginative faculties, but as a vital mode of relating to the world. Don Quixote explores the notion of reading on many levels. And as a reader, one must navigate a dizzying maze of subplots, plot twists, numerous characters, metafictional gestures, textual intermissions, and a constant use of nuanced irony, all of which makes the effort to single out what the book itself might be saying about reading a daring, if not impossible, enterprise. Nonetheless, I do believe the text elicits and circles around some crucial questions regarding the act of reading. Today, I will center on two questions, which of course are in no way exhaustive of the text. First question, how do I know that what I am reading is true? Or how to read a text if its relationship to the truth is nebulous or hard to ascertain? And secondly, how are we to read literary fiction? Is fiction in some sense dangerous? It is not my intent to try to formulate definitive answers, but better approximations to these questions. My goal is to articulate the tensions from which these questions arise and thereby broaden the discussion of what we may mean by reading. In conclusion, I will offer two examples from the text that I believe exemplify good reading. So how does the novel come to the first problem at the center of reading, namely, how do I know that what I am reading is the truth? Cervantes problematizes the act of reading immediately in the first page of the preface by removing himself from a conventional form of authorship and calling himself a stepfather and not father of Don Quixote. Not much later, Cervantes attributes the text to a Moorish historian or chronicler, Cide Hamete Benengeli, an unreliable narrator if there was ever any. For, quote, if any objection can be raised regarding the truth of this history, it can only be that its author was Arabic, since the people of that nation are very prone to telling falsehoods, end quote. It appears then that the first issue at stake in determining the veracity of a text points to authorship. The author's identity becomes the source of doubt. Reading across cultural difference, especially one's historical enemies, presents a problem: lack of trust. Others, particularly the others of a different faith in this case, are not to be trusted, and neither should we trust their text. Does Cervantes seriously believe this? Reading Don Quixote, we might be surprised at the ease with which certain characters, including Sancho Panza, display their animosity against Muslims, Jews, and Black Africans, while simultaneously expressing their pride in being old Christians, that is, in not having Sephardic or Moorish blood in their lineages. Perhaps it is worth noting that only 2 generations before Cervantes, during the cataclysmic year of 1492, the same year Columbus landed on the Bahamas, the Catholic monarchs Isabel of Castile and Fernando of Aragon conquered Granada, the last Moorish bastion on the Iberian Peninsula, and they issued the Alhambra Decree, which ordered the expulsion of the Jews from Spain within 4 months. The reality after the decree was that not all Jews left. Many converted by forced baptisms, the so-called conversos, and many others practiced their religion in secret. Similarly, Moors and their descendants, as well as assimilated or mixed-race individuals, known collectively as the Moriscos, remained in Spain. even though there was another decree during Cervantes' time that banished about 300,000 Moriscos. And we see this in the novel referenced with the character of Ricote, a neighbor of Sancho Panza. I will advance here that Cervantes, despite having expressed great pride in fighting against the Turk in the Battle of Lepanto, does not seriously subscribe to the vision of the cultural other as a source of falsehood. I can think of two instances in the novel that go against or at least problematize this position. In the first part, the novella of adventures known as The History of the Captive is one instance, the other being Sancho's interaction with the Morisco Ricote at the end of the second part. In The History of the Captive, Cervantes works against the expectations of the genre. In fact, all the intermittent stories that make the bulk of the first part follow certain conventions that make them identifiable either as pastoral romances, novella of adventures, the Italian novella, or the Spanish picaresque tale. The History of the Captive is well within the novella of adventures, which was usually set in exotic lands and ended with a return to one's homeland, to normalcy, and a reaffirmation of the culture to which the hero returns. As you may recall, The History of the Captive relates the story of Captain Viedma, a Christian who is enslaved in Algiers, and here there's an explicit biographical note because we know Cervantes was a captive in Algiers. Captain Viedma manages to get back to Spain with the aid of Zoraida, the daughter of the wealthy governor Aji Morato. As a result of having a Christian caretaker, Zoraida desires to convert to Christianity and pays the ransom for the Christian captive, and somehow, unbelievably, asks Captain Viedma to marry her and to take her to Spain. The narrative is a thrilling read as the escape from Algiers proves extremely difficult. On the one hand, the narrative ends as expected with a successful escape, but on the other hand, it unexpectedly highlights the pain of Aji Morato, the father of Zoraida. This character delivers a memorable speech as he sees the boat with his daughter taken away, a speech endowed with a pathos that adds a problematic dimension to the Christian story. In the end, Zoraida is in Spain. She becomes Maria. It's all good. But as readers, we have seen the cost of this conversion, leaving some of us with an uneasy feeling. The History of the Captive ends up, to some degree, humanizing the Moorish other. If Cervantes does not, in fact, subscribe to the notion of cultural otherness as a source of falsehood in text, what is he doing by claiming Cide Hamete as author of Don Quixote? The answer I will venture here may seem unserious, but I am quite serious. The device of Cide Hamete Benengeli as the true author of Don Quixote is a joke. It is an ironic gesture by which I simply mean saying one thing and meaning another. Irony in Cervantes tends towards the comical mode, although in the end the novel perhaps is extremely tragic. On the surface, the joke might well be on those readers who indeed hold a position that one can expect nothing but lies from Muslim authors. But perhaps more interestingly, this joke reveals a tantalizing thought, namely that authorship on its own cannot be the place where we can locate the truth of a text. As I mentioned before, authorship is in fact the first thing that Cervantes problematizes in the opening preface to the first part of Don Quixote. According to the author, the publication of this story depends on having the right living authors endorsing it and recommending it. On the recommendation of some unnamed friend, Cervantes makes up the usual sonnets and poems that endorse the book and attributes these pieces to fictional characters. Don Quixote, the novel, is a fiction endorsed by other fictions. Similarly, Cervantes tells his anonymous and perhaps fictitious friend that the novel lacks references to the consecrated authors of the canon. His friend proposes a solution, which is to reference authors from the canon superficially, so as to grant the text an air of authority. The joke here might just well be on pedantry and canon idolatry, that is, on those who might be too prone to equate authority with authorship without engaging in any kind of thinking. Although nowhere as iconoclastic as Francis Bacon, the preface positions Cervantes well within the epistemic shift of modernity that begins in the Renaissance. Not unlike Montaigne, Cervantes audaciously posits that he can and will say what needs to be said without the reference to canonical authors. The preface, moreover, postulates freedom of thought as a value. We readers are also welcome to say whatever we think of Don Quixote. For as it is commonly said, here I quote the text, "Under my cloak I can kill the king." Cervantes thus takes a position of distrust in authority, grounded in intellectual freedom, even if it means diminishing his own authority. Thus, the device of Cide Hamete as true author of Don Quixote not only becomes a way through which Cervantes can undermine his authorship, but also as a constant reminder to the reader to act under freedom of thought. In other words, through this playful and performative undermining of its veracity, the novel demands flexibility from the reader. We are asked to play. And if we don't play back, the book might prove to be insufferable. Besides, don't you want to play the game under our cloaks we can kill the king? In the realm of thought, nothing is forbidden. But as you may know, the playful undermining of veracity in the novel gets even more complicated. The problem of authorship is compounded by the issue of translation. For in fact, we are told Cervantes relies on a Morisco to translate the Arabic text of Don Quixote for him. This means that we are not reading the story of Don Quixote written in Spanish by Cide Hamete, but a translation of Cide Hamete's text produced by a random translator from Toledo who is not even a professional translator, but someone who may not even know the worth of the text he's translating. If as readers we want to join in the fun and entertain these literary games, we might then ask ourselves, what is exactly Cervantes' role as an author then? Is he simply the guy who paid for the text to be produced? Or does he work on a translated text somehow by embellishing it, organizing it, rewriting it? We do not know. What we know is that these games are meant to create distance, lots of distance between story and author. For not only does the story not belong to Cervantes, but he does not even own the language of the original story. I will say, Cervantes himself eventually ceases to play this game, for by the end of the second part, he reclaims authorship in a forceful manner. But in the first part of the novel and throughout most of the second part, Cervantes pushes the authorship game so far as to suggest that even Cide Hamete is not the author of the story in the conventional sense of someone who invented the story. The story of Don Quixote seems to have a pre-existence. For in the first chapter, we are told that many authors disagree on the Hidalgo's last name before becoming Don Quixote. Is it Quijada, Quesada, Quijana? Is later on Quijano? And furthermore, the preface references the archives of La Mancha as yet another source of the story of Don Quixote. We can therefore think of Cide Hamete as one of the many authors, or in the words of the text, Cide Hamete is but another cronista, or chronicler of the story. And here the word cronista is of great interest. It was a loaded word, for the initial historical accounts of the Spanish conquest of the so-called New World were not written by learned historians at first, but by cronistas or chroniclers. The chronicles of conquest are notorious for their disagreement on the most important facts. What really happened between Cortés and Montezuma, between Pizarro and Atahualpa? How was the violence unleashed? We have conflicting accounts. Moreover, Cervantes often refers to the story of Don Quixote as a quote-unquote true history, a common trope of these polemical New World chronicles. The veracity of these histories was highly contested, since knowing the truth of the Spanish invasion of the Americas had serious consequences. Ever since the so-called discovery, Spanish monarchs from Isabel of Castile to Charles V had to deal with the credibility of these chronicles, some of them written by conquistadors, governors, and soldiers, and the other opposing chronicles from missionaries, the most noteworthy being the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, whose histories painted a portrait of genocidal violence, slavery, and unhinged exploitation of natural resources with no regard to divine and human laws. The history of Spanish imperialism is not my focus here, though I will share for now that there were many attempts made at of determining whether the wars of conquest were just or legitimate, whether the natives were being enslaved and exploited, and whether the New World lands had been taken by legitimate possession. Early on, there were laws passed, the laws of Burgos and their reform, the so-called new laws. Philosophical debates and treatises came out from the University of Salamanca, and some conquistadors were even prosecuted for cruelty and abuses, Juan de Oñate for his deeds here in New Mexico being one of them. But in the end, these attempts to rein in colonization proved to be insufficient, and by the time of Cervantes, writing concerning the New World was strictly censored and controlled. It is worth noting that when the barber and the priest conduct an inquisitorial scrutiny of Don Quixote's library, there are no New World histories to be found. In the end, the early profusion of chronicles or histories, followed by an aggressive inquisitorial censorship on the genre, left us with the conflicting primary sources. How can one determine what is true if one receives 5 different accounts, all claiming to be the true history of the conquest of New Spain, for example? And to complicate matters more, all of these chronicles had no choice but to attend to native informants and unreliable translators of languages that had yet to be studied and fully understood. Don Quixote, a work of literature that devours and contains many genres, also incorporates the genre of the New World Chronicle. Or to be more precise, it parodies the genre. After all, the text often reminds us that we are reading a chronicle or the true history of a knight-errant who goes out into the world to seek adventures, hoping to thereby gain fame and an empire large enough so that an island can be given to his squire to govern. Parody of the New World Chronicle might be what inspires Cervantes to craft the literary devices and tropes that seem to undermine his own authorship and the language of the text as an access point to something like the truth. So what is the use of putting forth a new kind of fiction, let's call it the Cervantine novel, that emphasizes ambiguity? In what sense is this parody of historical writing instructive? What are we to gain as readers by engaging with a book that insists on problematizing the relationship between truth and text? If there are no originals, if there are no trustworthy authors, the responsibility to determine the truth of a given text lies entirely with us, the readers. Parody, which in Greek means something like against or besides the song, is the literary form that deliberately mocks a given model. By parodying historical writing, the more polemical and urgent kind of historical writing, Cervantes playfully and seriously at once urges us to take reading into our own hands. By nature of its irreverence, parody liberates us from pre-established expectations and prejudiced ways of reading the text. The Cervantine novel thus becomes, perhaps more so than any other genre of writing, an invitation to exercise our intellectual freedom in a way that other forms of writing do not. The Cervantine novel presents itself as an imitation of the full ambiguity of the world. The novel thus leads us to consider the broader question regarding the effects of imaginative literature. Is literature dangerous? Philosophically, this is an old problem, or perhaps an ancient quarrel. Most of us here are familiar with the question, how can fiction, something that is false, contain any truth? In Don Quixote, Cervantes probes the standing of fiction in general, beginning with what appears to be an open critique of a particular genre, namely chivalric romance. Being unable to ascertain the truth of the New World Chronicles had serious consequences in terms of loss of life and massive injustice. How could there be similar dangers to the effects of fiction? And are the books of chivalry particularly dangerous? Alonso Quijano believes the books of chivalry to be true, and in becoming Don Quixote, he attempts to bridge fiction and life. How is that a bad thing? What are the serious consequences of Don Quixote's madness? Is Alonso Quijano a hero of literature or a victim of fiction? The novel confronts this problem directly as the first part comes to an end. Don Quixote's friends, the barber and priest, have managed to enchant Don Quixote with the help of Dorotea and lock him up in a cage in order to bring him back home. On their way to Don Quixote's village, the troupe encounters a man described as a canon from Toledo who inquires after Don Quixote. After the priest recounts the story of Don Quixote's madness, the canon from Toledo asserts, echoing Plato, that the books of chivalry are prejudicial to the Republic. He then puts forth a critique of the genre in terms of classical poetics. First, according to the canon from Toledo, the books of chivalry violate the precept from Horace that literature ought to delight and to instruct. Books of chivalry are in reality, quote, Milesian tales, which are foolish stories meant only to delight and not to teach, unlike moral tales, which delight and teach at the same time, end quote. In the canon's view, literature ought to have an ethical dimension. Fiction ought to be exemplary, a place where readers can admire, quote, the guile of Ulysses, the piety of Aeneas, the valor of Achilles, the prudence of Cato. In short, all of those characteristics that make a noble man perfect, end quote. Moreover, according to the canon, books of chivalry violate the classical notion of harmonious and realistic representation, or mimesis, without which there can be no real delight. Quote, what beauty, what proportion between parts and the whole, or the whole and its parts, can there be in a book or tale in which a boy of 16, with one thrust of his sword, fells a giant as big as a tower and splits him in two as if he were marzipan? If one were to reply that those who compose these books write them as fictions and therefore are not obliged to consider the fine points of truth, I should respond that the more truthful the fiction, the better it is, and the more probable and possible, the more pleasing. Fictional tales must engage the minds of those who read them, and by restraining exaggeration and moderating impossibility, they enthrall the spirit and thereby astonish, captivate, delight, and entertain, allowing wonder and joy to move together at the same pace. None of these things can be accomplished by fleeing verisimilitude and mimesis, which together constitute perfection in writing. I have seen no book of chivalry that creates a complete tale, a body with all its members intact, so that the middle corresponds to the beginning and the end to the beginning and then the middle. Instead, they are composed with so many members that the intention seems to shape a chimera or a monster rather than to create a well-proportioned figure. Since they are totally lacking in intelligent artifice, they deserve to be banished, like unproductive people from Christian nations. End quote. Fiction that only seeks to delight, that lacks completeness and proportion, and that does not adhere to realistic representation ought to be banished from the Christian Republic. The similarity with Plato is palpable, as the exemplarity of literary representations becomes a central concern in the Republic. But at the outset at least, Plato's critique of mimesis is also grounded in ontological and epistemic concerns. Literary fictions are imitations of imitations, farther removed from the forms therefore less real and less true. The philosophical concern might be that there is an epistemic harm caused by fiction. This harm is not articulated by the canon of Toledo, even though it might be implicit in the novel if we interpret Don Quixote's madness as a kind of epistemic harm, the harm being an inability to distinguish between truth and lies, between history and fiction. As forceful as the critique presented by the canon might be, Cervantes quickly complicates its directness by muddying the waters yet again. Despite the canon's harsh sentence on books of chivalry, at the outset of his diatribes, we are made aware of an interesting fact. Quote, "Truly, Señor Priest, it seems to me that the books called novels of chivalry are prejudicial to the nation, and though I, moved by a false and idle state, have read the beginning of almost every one that has ever been published," end quote. For a man that finds these books so harmful to society, it is sure interesting that he can't help himself and has almost read every book of chivalry that has ever been published. What's even more, the canon then reveals, or perhaps confesses, that he has felt a certain temptation to write a book of chivalry. And quote, "To tell the truth, I have already written more than 100 pages. End quote. I wonder how often can the canon be moved by his idle and false state? How acute of a problem is idleness for human beings that it may drive them towards an allegedly harmful entertainment? It appears that the pull of the imagination, chimerical imagination, is hard to resist. Throughout the novel, we're constantly learning that most characters have read more than plenty of these harmful books. The barber and the priest, the first innkeeper, Lucinda, Dorotea, the second innkeeper and his daughter, although illiterate, know all about the books of chivalry through oral readings, and finally the canon himself. Are instructive and exemplary fictions not as exciting or entertaining? Why does everyone seem to gravitate to books of chivalry even if they might be perfectly aware of their imaginative excesses and formal deficiencies? Does Cervantes know that their banishment from the Republic is not only impractical, but perhaps impossible? Is everyone suffering from Don Quixote's madness in one degree or another? Can human imaginations be truly isolated or protected? In light of these questions, it is worth reflecting on Don Quixote's defense of the books of chivalry. After his conversation with the priest, the canon confronts Don Quixote directly. He asks, "Is it possible, Señor, that the grievous and idle reading of books of chivalry could have so affected your grace that it has unbalanced your judgment and made you believe that you are enchanted, along with other things of this nature, which are as far from being true as truth is from lies?" End quote. The canon advises Don Quixote that he can still follow his natural inclination and read about great chivalric deeds, but as recorded in true histories, such as the deeds of Caesar, Alexander the Great, or recent Spanish captains. Don Quixote responds with a fascinating defense. First, he quickly overwhelms the canon with a litany of literary and historical examples, implicitly proposing that there is a continuous line of heroic figures across time and geography, whether they be Achilles or the legendary but historical Spanish knight known as El Cid. According to Don Quixote, to deny the truth of chivalric histories is to deny all of history, a position that might seem less surprising if we consider that the Spanish language does not distinguish between history and story. They are both historia. Secondly, Don Quixote refers to the widespread public approval of these books as well as the state's sanction of them. Quote, "Books that are printed with royal license and with the approval of officials to whom they are submitted, and read to widespread delight, and celebrated by great and small, poor and rich, educated and ignorant, low-born and gentry, in short, by all kinds of persons of every rank and station, Can they possibly lie? End quote. According to this view, the entire world operates under the assumption that these books are not only harmless, but beneficial. In fact, Don Quixote's third argument consists of insisting on the great benefit of literary delight. Quote, "And your grace should believe me when I tell you, as I already have, to read these books, and you will see how they drive away melancholy if you are so afflicted, and improve your spirits if they happen to be low." End quote. And not only that, but Don Quixote also affirms to have become a better person as a result of his reading. Quote, "For myself I can say that since I became a knight-errant, I have been valiant, well-mannered, liberal, polite, generous, courteous, bold, gentle, patient, long-suffering in labors, imprisonments, and enchantments. And although only a short while ago I saw myself locked in a cage like a madman, I think that with the valor of my arm, and heaven favoring me and fortune not opposing me, in a few days I shall find myself the king of some kingdom where I can display the gratitude and liberality of my heart." End quote. It's hard to be a Spaniard. Becoming fiction is Don Quixote's way of realizing an ethical and heroic ideal. He does not seem to be seeking escapist entertainment. On the contrary, believing these histories to be a source of good, he wants to bring them into life. There is a nobility to Don Quixote's madness. He's no escapist buffoon. Moreover, his lucid speeches on the Golden Age, on arms and letters, or his political advice to Sancho before he goes to govern his fake island are truly remarkable. As Don Quixote intoxicates himself with his own speeches, it proves difficult for many of us, the readers, not to delight in his masterful rhetoric and literary imagination. We become, dare I say, enchanted. And yet, as sympathetic and charming as we might find Don Quixote, the quixotic imagination brings with it some serious complications, namely its inflexibility, its disdain for physical reality, and its difficulty adapting to the pushback from the external world. The inflexibility of the quixotic imagination leads to conflict. Most violent episodes in the novel stem from Don Quixote's uncompromising reading of the world. During his first sally, as he encounters merchants from Toledo, he stops them, and imitating knights errant, yes, but also echoing almost verbatim the legal requirement for New World conquistadors to demand that indigenous peoples accept and confess the truth of the Holy Catholic faith, or be ready for war. He says, quote, "Halt, all of you, unless all of you confess that in the entire world there's no damsel more beauteous than the Empress of La Mancha, the peerless Dulcinea del Toboso." End quote. The merchants reply that they do not know her, but if Don Quixote could show her to them, they will freely confess the truth he demands. "If I were to show her to you," replied Don Quixote, "where would the virtue be in your confessing so obvious a truth? The significance lies in not seeing her and believing, confessing, affirming, swearing, and defending that truth. If you do not, you must do battle with me, audacious and arrogant people." End quote. Don Quixote charges at the man who resisted him, but Rocinante trips and Don Quixote falls to the ground. Unable to get up, one of the mule drivers breaks a part of his lance and thrashes Don Quixote as if he were threshing wheat. Violence was sure to ensue. Furthermore, the quixotic imagination also undermines physical reality, which leads to bodily suffering and destruction of the means to preserve human life. Broken windmills, empty wine sacks, dead sheep. And besides, Is there a more disembodied character in all of literature? Don Quixote hardly eats and hardly sleeps, and in this sense his short-lived first sally reveals that the quixotic imagination goes nowhere without some kind of embodiment. Hence, the second and third sallies require Sancho Panza. He provides money, food, and the means to heal wounds. The imagination cannot be sustained without a belly. Sancho's last name, Panza, means belly. In the first part of the novel, Sancho metaphorically and literally digests the adventures. This is exemplified by the effects on Don Quixote and Sancho of the magical potion that heals everything, the balm of Fierabras. Don Quixote vomits it. Sancho is forced to digest it, and it almost kills him. And lastly, the quixotic imagination seems unable to adapt successfully to the pushback from the external world. In other words, when the world refuses to correspond with the quixotic imagination, the enchanters are to be blamed for changing the order of things. At first, the enchanters seem to be a way through which the quixotic imagination justifies the mutability of the world, but by the second part, Don Quixote himself appears to wear out by the enchanters. In part 2, by the end of yet another disastrous adventure, the one of the enchanted boat, in which another reality seems to be supplanted to supplant what Don Quixote was imagining, he expresses his disappointment in these memorable words. Enough! In this adventure, 2 valiant enchanters must have had an encounter. One hinders what the other attempts. One provided me with a boat, and the other threw me out of it. God help us. For the entire world is nothing but tricks and deceptions opposing one another. I can do no more. End quote. The text here almost reads like a defeat and seems to point to an end. But it is right after this chapter that the Duke and Duchess appear on the scene and reinvigorate the quixotic imagination by using their wealth to recreate the chivalric world, though this too will prove to be another pushback from the external world. In the end, the irony at the center of the quixotic imagination is that in its drive to merge literature and life, it ends up threatening life. Taking this tension seriously might reorient us away from a kind of reading that seeks the truth to a kind of reading that privileges flexibility, creativity, and joy as life-affirming orientations. In other words, Cervantes gives great weight to the fact that the status of truth will remain contested in a world rendered ambiguous by the multifaceted powers of imagination. But unlike Descartes, who facing the enchanters retreats to the mind, Cervantes encourages us to test our judgment and read the world artistically. How are we to do it? Does Cervantes offer an alternative to the canon's strict prescriptions that claim to know the real and the force of the quixotic imagination? As a way of concluding, I would like to suggest that this novel does portray good readers from which we can learn from. And I'll briefly offer 2 examples. In the first part of the novel, that reader is Dorotea. Wronged by the nobleman Don Fernando, she escapes to the countryside in disguise. But as she encounters Cardenio and Lucinda, and as she reads their oral stories, she manages to come up with a ploy that allows her to persuade Don Fernando to right the wrongs he committed. And she accomplishes all this while also pretending to be the Princess Micomicona, as she is moved by compassion and offers to help bring Don Quixote home. Like Don Quixote, she's a masterful imitator of the language of chivalric romance, but she is flexible, embodied, and receptive to the pressures of the world. She can code switch between the language of the Spanish nobility as codified by the pastoral romance and the language of chivalric romance. And as the ruse by the priest and barber appears to be revealed when she misreads her own fictitious princess story, she manages to correct herself in astute ways in order to coax Don Quixote gently. Good readership becomes more difficult in the second part, as the characters there have all read the first part of Don Quixote, and they insist on imposing their readings or misreadings on Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. The world becomes more constrained as it reads them in equivocal ways. Don Quixote's agency is increasingly diminished by the sadistic ploys of the Duke and Duchess and by the intervention of the bachelor Sansón Carrasco. The Cave of Montesinos episode, where Don Quixote is lowered into a cave and relates fantastical visions that span 3 days as opposed to 30 minutes, can thus be read as an attempt by the quixotic imagination to regain control. And yet it is in this environment that Sancho Panza thrives. He manages to outmaneuver the fictional trappings set by the Duke and Duchess, including his own fake governorship, which he gives up in what might be the most extraordinary change in the whole novel. And after he leaves his governorship, he displays great humanity and care with his exiled Morisco friend, Ricote. In the end, the illiterate squire learns how to read. Cervantes' fiction teaches us that reading can be understood more broadly as a way of relating to the world. In fact, as a vital way of relating to the world. For even if one does not know how to read and write, one is constantly reading the world, and the world is constantly reading us. Whether as individuals or collectives, this novel proposes that we are our narratives. Narratives with the ability to change and modify as we read the world and as we read others. Reading artfully according to Cervantes, that is, reading thoughtfully, but also flexibly, playfully, and irreverently, allows us to minimize or resolve seemingly irreconcilable conflicts, to act on our compassion more effectively, and to reclaim the freedom of our mind within a constrained world that might insist on misreading us. Still, it cannot be denied that the boldness of the quixotic imagination plays a fundamental role in the art of reading. The impetus the quixotic imagination has, its energy, its joy, its playfulness, its nobility, allows Don Quixote and some of the characters around him to go beyond themselves, beyond melancholy, and beyond an impoverished reality where they can imagine and set forth on the adventures that make life worth living. Without the drive of the quixotic imagination, both literature and life end. And perhaps one of this novel's greatest lessons is that we ought to sustain, artfully, the quixotic in all of us. For as Sancho tells Don Quixote in his last moments, the greatest madness a man can commit in this life is to let himself die. Thank you.